My name is Vincent Fielding, and I've been the caretaker of Whitmore Private Cemetery for 8 months now. When I took the job, I thought it would be simple work. Mow the grass, trim the hedges, keep the headstones clean. The pay was good, and the previous caretaker, Harold Vance, left behind a small cottage on the property where I could live, rent-free. Harold had worked here for 37 years before he retired. On my first day, he handed me a worn leather notebook and said, "Everything you need to know is in there. Follow the rules exactly, Vincent. Exactly." I flipped through the pages that first evening. Most of it was normal stuff. Maintenance schedules, contact information for the groundskeeping company, notes about which families visited regularly. But then I found the list that made me pause. Special plot requirements. I flipped through the pages that first evening. Most of it was normal stuff. Maintenance schedules, contact information for the groundskeeping company, notes about which families visited regularly. But then I found the list that made me pause. Special plot requirements. Plot 7, Eleanor Whitmore. Always leave fresh roses, red only. Replace every 3 days. Plot 15, Dr. Benjamin Marsh. Keep the grass cut to exactly 2 inches. Never shorter, never longer. Plot 22, Sarah and David Kellerman. Place 2 smooth river stones on the headstone each morning. Remove them at sunset. Plot 31, Theodore Teddy Ashworth. Wind the music box on the grave marker once per week. Sunday mornings only. Plot 44, Constance Vale. Fill the small brass cup with fresh rainwater after each storm. Never use tap water. At first, I figured these were just special requests from grieving families, rich people with odd traditions. The Whitmore family owned the cemetery after all, so they could make whatever rules they wanted. I decided to follow them exactly as Harold had instructed. The first few weeks went smoothly. I kept Eleanor's roses fresh, measured Dr. Marsh's grass with a ruler, collected river stones from the small creek that ran along the cemetery's edge, wound little Teddy's music box every Sunday morning, and filled Constance's cup whenever it rained. The cemetery was peaceful during those early days. Only about 50 plots in total, arranged in neat rows with plenty of space between them. Pine trees lined the perimeter, and the whole place had a quiet dignity that I found comforting. Families would visit on weekends, leaving flowers and sitting quietly beside their loved ones. Everything changed the day I forgot about Eleanor's roses. It was a Tuesday in October. I'd been running behind all week because the riding mower had broken down, and I'd been cutting grass by hand with a push mower. The physical work left me exhausted by evening, and I completely forgot to check on Plot 7. Wednesday morning, I walked my usual rounds and noticed Eleanor's roses had wilted. The red petals had turned brown and dropped onto the grass around her headstone. I felt a stab of guilt. Her family had trusted me to maintain their tradition, and I'd let them down. I hurried to the supply shed where Harold had left cases of fresh roses in a refrigerated cooler. As I walked back toward Plot 7, I noticed something that made me slow my steps. The grass around Eleanor's grave looked different. Not dead or dying, but greener than the rest of the cemetery. Much greener. The color was so vibrant it almost hurt to look at directly, like staring at a computer screen in a dark room. I knelt down and touched the grass. It felt normal under my fingers, but when I pulled my hand away, tiny droplets of moisture clung to my palm. The morning dew had long since evaporated from everywhere else, but this patch of ground seemed to be sweating. I replaced the roses quickly and made a mental note to never let them wilt again. But the grass stayed that vibrant green for 3 more days. The next incident happened 2 weeks later with Dr. Marsh's plot. I'd been extra careful about measuring his grass, keeping it at exactly 2 inches as instructed. But on a particularly busy Friday, I misjudged one section and cut it down to about 1.5 inches. Saturday morning, I found footprints in the shorter grass. Not human footprints. These were smaller, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. They circled Dr. Marsh's headstone 3 times before disappearing at the edge of the plot. The prints were pressed deep into the earth, as if whatever made them had been much heavier than its size suggested. I spent the weekend researching local wildlife, trying to identify what could have made those marks. Nothing matched. The closest I could find were raccoon tracks. But these were different. The spacing was off, and raccoons don't have claws that long. The grass grew back to exactly 2 inches by Monday morning. That's when I called Harold. "You're following the rules, right?" he asked when I explained what I'd seen. "Yes, mostly. I had a couple small mistakes, but..." "No mistakes," Harold interrupted. "I told you to follow them exactly. There's a reason those rules exist, Vincent." "What reason? What happens if I don't follow them?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. "The families who are buried there, they made specific arrangements when they purchased their plots. Special contracts. The rules aren't just traditions, son. They're part of the agreement." "Agreement with who?" "With them." I waited for Harold to explain further, but he'd already hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the vibrant grass and the strange footprints. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I decided to walk through the cemetery. Sometimes fresh air helped clear my head. The night was cool and still. No wind moved through the pine trees, and the only sound was my footsteps on the gravel path. I brought a flashlight but kept it pointed down, so I wouldn't disturb any neighbors who might be looking out their windows. As I walked past the special plots, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Each of the 5 graves had a faint glow around their headstones. Not bright like electric light, more like the way watch hands glow in the dark after being exposed to light during the day. A soft, greenish phosphorescence that outlined the carved letters on each marker. I stopped walking and stared. The glow was definitely there, but so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking directly at the stones. I turned off my flashlight completely and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The glow became more noticeable. Each headstone pulsed gently, like a slow heartbeat made of light. I walked closer to plot 7, where Eleanor lay beneath her fresh red roses. The glow around her headstone seemed to respond to my presence, becoming slightly brighter as I approached. When I was about 3 feet away, the pulsing quickened. I backed away slowly, and the pulsing returned to its original rhythm. The same thing happened at each of the special plots. The closer I got, the brighter and faster the glow became, like they knew I was there. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my cottage porch, watching the cemetery from a distance. The glow continued until just before dawn, when it faded away completely. The next morning, I decided to do some research. The Whitmore family had owned this land for over 100 years. The cemetery had been established in 1923, but the land itself had been in the family much longer. I found old property records at the county courthouse that mentioned a Whitmore farm dating back to the 1880s. What I couldn't find was any information about the people buried in the special plots. Eleanor Whitmore's records showed she died in 1967, but there was no birth record or family history. Dr. Benjamin Marsh had apparently practiced medicine in town for 30 years, but I couldn't find his medical license or any mention of him in local newspaper archives. Sarah and David Kellerman were listed as a married couple who died in a car accident in 1982, but there was no accident report and no record of them ever living in the area. Theodore Ashworth and Constance Vale were equally mysterious. It was as if these people had been carefully inserted into the public records but had never actually existed in any meaningful way. That evening, I called the Whitmore family's lawyer, a man named Robert Crane who handled all the cemetery's legal affairs. "Mr. Fielding," he said when I identified myself, "how can I help you?" "I have some questions about the special burial plots, the ones with specific maintenance requirements." "What about them?" "Well, I'm having trouble finding background information on the people buried there. I wanted to understand the history behind their requests." Mr. Crane was quiet for several seconds. "Mr. Fielding, Your job is to maintain the cemetery according to the guidelines provided. The background information is not relevant to your duties. I understand, but I'm curious about... Curiosity is not part of your employment contract, Mr. Crane said firmly. Follow the rules exactly as written. That's all you need to do. He hung up before I could ask anything else. The next few weeks passed without incident. I followed the rules perfectly, and the cemetery remained peaceful. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched whenever I worked near the special plots. It wasn't a feeling of being observed by hidden eyes or lurking figures. It was more like the sensation of walking past a house where you know someone is home, even though you can't see them through the windows. The plots themselves seemed aware of my presence. November brought the first hard frost, and with it, a new problem. One morning, I found that the music box on Teddy Ashworth's grave wouldn't wind anymore. The key turned freely, but there was no resistance, and no music played when I released it. The mechanism appeared to be broken. I spent the day trying to fix it, but I couldn't figure out what was wrong. The box looked antique, maybe from the 1940s or 1950s, with intricate brass fittings and a porcelain figure of a little boy that was supposed to dance when the music played. That night, I heard piano music coming from the cemetery. It started around midnight, a simple melody that sounded like a lullaby. I recognized it as the same tune that usually played from Teddy's music box. But this version was fuller, richer, as if being played on a real piano rather than the tiny mechanism inside the music box. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to investigate. The music was definitely coming from the direction of plot 31. As I got closer, I could see that the glow around Teddy's headstone was much brighter than usual, pulsing in time with the melody. But there was no piano anywhere in the cemetery. The music continued for about 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The glow around the headstone faded back to its normal level, and the cemetery fell silent again. The next morning, I checked the music box again. It worked perfectly, as if it had never been broken. I wound it carefully and listened to the familiar lullaby, trying to match it with what I'd heard the night before. The melody was the same, but the nighttime version had included harmonies and variations that the simple music box couldn't produce. That's when I made my first serious mistake. Instead of leaving well enough alone, I decided to test what would happen if I didn't wind the music box the following Sunday. I told myself it was scientific curiosity. I wanted to understand the rules and their consequences. If I knew what happened when the rules were broken, maybe I could understand why they existed in the first place. Sunday morning came, and I deliberately avoided plot 31. By evening, I regretted my decision. The piano music started again around midnight, but this time it was different. Louder, more insistent. The melody was still recognizable as the lullaby, but it was played in a minor key that made it sound desperate and pleading. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the music continued for hours. Around 3 in the morning, it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the music. Monday morning, I hurried to plot 31 to wind the music box and set things right. But when I arrived, I found something that made my stomach drop. The little porcelain figure inside the music box had turned around. When Harold had first shown me the music box, the figure faced forward, toward the front of the cemetery. Now it faced backward, toward the woods at the rear of the property. Its painted eyes seemed to stare directly at me with an expression I hadn't noticed before. The expression looked sad and hungry. I wound the music box quickly, hoping the figure would turn back around when the mechanism activated, but it remained facing backward, even as the familiar lullaby began to play. That night, I called Harold again. "You broke one of the rules," he said, before I could even explain what had happened. "How did you know?" "Because you're calling me at night instead of during normal hours. That's what I used to do when something went wrong." I told him about the music box and the figure that had turned around. "Which way is it facing now?" Harold asked. "Toward the back of the cemetery. toward the woods. Good. That's not the worst direction. When I first started working there, I missed winding it for 2 weeks straight. The figure ended up facing the cottage. What does that mean? It means you need to be more careful, Vincent. The rules exist for good reasons. I thought 37 years was enough time for me to figure out what those reasons were, but I never did. I just learned to follow them exactly. Harold, what are those graves really? Who are those people? I don't know, son, and I learned a long time ago that I don't want to know. The next few weeks I was extra careful with all the rules. Fresh roses for Eleanor every 3 days. Dr. Marsh's grass at exactly 2 inches. River stones for the Kellermans each morning and evening. The music box wound every Sunday. Rainwater for Constance whenever it stormed. But the damage was already done. The porcelain figure in Teddy's music box continued to face backward, and I began to notice other small changes around the cemetery. The glow around the headstones became visible even during daylight hours, though very faintly. The grass around Eleanor's plot stayed that vibrant green color permanently. Strange footprints appeared near Dr. Marsh's grave even when I kept his grass at the perfect length. Most disturbing of all, I started finding things near the special plots that didn't belong there. Small objects that seemed to have been placed deliberately. A child's toy soldier near Teddy's grave. A stethoscope near Dr. Marsh's plot. 2 wedding rings near the Kellerman's headstone. I tried moving these objects, but they always reappeared the next day in exactly the same spots. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came my biggest challenge yet. The small creek where I collected river stones for the Kellermans froze solid in December. I tried breaking through the ice to reach the stones underneath, but they were frozen in place. For the first time since I'd started working at the cemetery, I couldn't follow one of the rules. I placed regular stones from elsewhere on the property on their headstone, hoping it would be close enough. But I knew it wasn't the same. That night, I heard voices coming from plot 22. 2 people having a quiet conversation. Their words too low for me to understand, but their tone unmistakably sad. I crept closer to listen, but as soon as I got within 20 feet of their grave, the voices stopped. The next morning, I found 2 perfect river stones sitting on top of the Kellerman's headstone. They were exactly the type I usually collected from the creek, smooth and round, and still damp as if they'd just been pulled from running water. But the creek remained frozen solid. I decided not to question this gift too closely. I followed my usual routine, removing the stones at sunset and placing them back at sunrise, even though I had no idea where they were coming from. The stones appeared fresh each morning throughout the winter. As spring approached, I had been working at Whitmore Cemetery for almost a year. I'd grown accustomed to the strange rules and their subtle consequences. The glowing headstones, the mysterious objects, the feeling of being watched, all of it had become part of my normal routine. I thought I had everything under control. As spring approached, I had been working at Whitmore Cemetery for almost a year. I'd grown accustomed to the strange rules and their subtle consequences. The glowing headstones, the mysterious objects, the feeling of being watched, all of it had become part of my normal routine. I thought I had everything under control. I was about to learn how wrong I was. The trouble started on a rainy Thursday in March when I made my second serious mistake. I'd been battling a nasty flu for 3 days, running a fever and barely able to get out of bed. The storm had been pounding the area since Tuesday, and I knew I needed to collect rainwater for Constance Vale's brass cup. But every time I tried to get up and walk to the cemetery, dizziness would knock me back down. By Thursday evening, the storm had passed, and I finally felt well enough to venture outside. I grabbed an old mason jar and hurried to plot 44, planning to collect some water from the puddles that had formed around Constance's headstone. But when I arrived, I found that her brass cup was already full. Clear, fresh rainwater filled the small cup to the brim. It looked exactly like what I would have collected myself, except for one detail that made me pause. The water was warm, not room temperature, but genuinely warm, as if it had been heated on a stove. Steam rose from the surface in thin wisps that dispersed quickly in the cool evening air. I reached out to touch the side of the brass cup and pulled my hand back immediately. The metal was hot enough to burn. This had never happened before. Rainwater was supposed to be cold, and the brass cup had always remained at normal temperature. I stood there for several minutes, unsure of what to do. Finally, I decided to leave the water alone. Someone or something had filled the cup properly, and the rule only specified that it needed to contain fresh rainwater after each storm. The temperature hadn't been mentioned. But that night, I heard something that changed everything. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of someone humming outside my cottage. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, carrying a tune I didn't recognize. The humming seemed to come from the direction of Plot 44. I looked out my bedroom window but couldn't see anyone in the cemetery. The humming continued for about 20 minutes, then faded away gradually, as if the woman had been walking slowly into the distance. The next morning, I checked Constance's cup again. The water was gone, and the brass had returned to normal temperature. Over the following weeks, I began to notice other changes in the cemetery's behavior. The objects that appeared near the special plots became more numerous and more personal. Instead of finding just one or two items, I would discover small collections arranged carefully around each headstone. Near Eleanor's roses, vintage photographs of people I didn't recognize, antique jewelry, and handwritten letters in faded ink. Near Dr. Marsh's plot, medical instruments from what looked like the early 1900s, prescription bottles with illegible labels, and a leather medical bag that appeared to be decades old. Near the Kellermans, wedding invitations, love letters, and pairs of items, 2 coffee cups, 2 books, 2 everything. Near Teddy's music box, children's toys from different eras, hand-drawn pictures in crayon, and small wooden animals that looked hand-carved. Near Constance's brass cup, dried flowers, poetry written in elegant handwriting, and bottles of various perfumes. The items seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking. I would clean them away in the morning, and by evening, new objects would have appeared in their place. More troubling was what happened when visitors came to the cemetery. The Whitmore family had always been the most frequent visitors, typically coming every few weeks to place flowers on various family graves. But lately, their visits had become strained and uncomfortable. I watched from a distance as family members would approach the normal graves without issue. But when they passed near the special plots, their behavior would change. They would walk faster, speak in whispers, and avoid making eye contact with the 5 special headstones. Last week, I overheard a conversation between 2 elderly Whitmore relatives. "It's getting worse," the woman said as they hurried past Plot 7. "Mother used to say we should never have agreed to their arrangement." "Too late now," the man replied. "Contract was signed decades ago. We're bound to honor it." "But look at this place. It's not natural anymore." "It was never natural, Helen. That was the point." They left quickly after that, and I haven't seen them since. The breaking point came on a Sunday in early April. I had been extra careful with all the rules, but that morning when I went to win Teddy's music box, I found something that made my hands shake. The porcelain figure wasn't alone anymore. A second figure had appeared inside the music box, a larger one that looked like an adult woman. She was positioned behind the little boy, with her hands on his shoulders in what might have been a protective gesture. But her painted face wore an expression of desperate hunger that made me want to slam the music box shut immediately. Instead, I wound it as usual and listened to the familiar lullaby. But now, there was a harmony line, a second melody that intertwined with the original tune. The woman figure moved slightly as the music played, swaying back and forth in a rhythm that didn't quite match the song. That night, the piano music returned, but it was different again. Instead of coming from Plot 31, it seemed to originate from all 5 special plots at once. Multiple instruments joined the piano, a violin, a flute, voices humming in harmony. The music was beautiful but deeply unsettling, like a concert performed by people who had forgotten they were dead. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but around 2 in the morning, I heard my name being called. Vincent. The voice was soft, barely audible over the music. It could have been male or female, young or old, but it was definitely calling my name. Vincent, come outside. I stayed in bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from monsters. But the voice continued, growing slightly louder and more insistent. Vincent, we need to talk. Finally, against my better judgment, I got dressed and stepped outside. The music stopped immediately. The cemetery was completely silent and still. No wind moved through the trees, and even the usual night sounds of insects and small animals were absent. The only light came from the glow around the 5 special headstones, which pulsed in perfect synchronization. I stood on my cottage porch, waiting for someone to speak or show themselves, but nothing happened for several minutes. Then, slowly, I began to see them, not as solid figures, but as suggestions of people. Faint outlines that became visible only when I looked slightly away from them. They stood near their respective graves, watching me with expressions I couldn't quite make out. Eleanor Whitmore stood beside her roses, wearing what looked like a dress from the 1960s. Dr. Marsh was near his perfectly maintained grass, dressed in an old-fashioned medical coat. The Kellermans stood hand in hand near their headstone. Little Teddy sat cross-legged beside his music box. Constance Vale stood with perfect posture near her brass cup. "You've been taking good care of us," Eleanor said, though her lips didn't seem to move. Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We appreciate your dedication," added Dr. Marsh. "Harold was reliable, but you've been more attentive." "What do you want from me?" I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Want?" Constance laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "We don't want anything, dear. We're perfectly content." "Then why are you showing yourselves to me now?" The 5 figures exchanged glances that somehow conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. "Because," Teddy said in a voice that sounded exactly like a living child, "our contract is almost complete." "What contract?" "The agreement our families made with the Whitmores," Sarah Kellerman explained. "A place to rest in exchange for services." "What kind of services?" Dr. Marsh stepped forward, his faint outline becoming slightly more solid. "We maintain the boundary, Vincent. We keep certain things from crossing over." "Crossing over from where?" "From the woods," David Kellerman said, pointing toward the tree line at the back of the cemetery. "There are places in this world where the barriers are thin. This property sits on one of those places." I looked toward the woods, which had always seemed perfectly normal to me. Just pine trees and undergrowth, nothing threatening or unusual. "The Whitmore family knew about the boundary when they established the cemetery," Eleanor continued. "They needed guardians to keep it stable, so they made arrangements with people who were willing to stay." "You mean you chose to be buried here?" "We chose to remain here," Constance corrected. "Death was merely a transition." "But why are you telling me this now?" The 5 figures grew more solid, their outlines filling in with color and detail. For the first time, they looked like real people rather than suggestions of people. "Because the contract specifies that after a certain period of service, we can choose to move on," Teddy explained. "And our time is almost up." "So you're leaving?" "We're considering it," Dr. Marsh said. "But if we go, the boundary will need new guardians." The implication hit me like a physical blow. "You want me to take your place?" "Not immediately," Sarah assured me quickly. "The transition would be gradual. You could continue living normally for many years. But eventually, yes, you would join us." "And if I refuse?" The figures exchanged another one of their silent conversations. "Then we'll find someone else," Eleanor said finally. But you've been so good with the rules, Vincent. You understand the importance of details, of following instructions exactly. That's a rare quality. The rules you gave me, they're not just maintenance requirements, are they? No, Constance admitted. They're rituals that strengthen our connection to this place and maintain the boundary. Every time you follow them, you help us do our job. And every time I break them, the boundary weakens, Dr. Marsh said grimly. Things start to cross over that shouldn't. I thought about the vibrant grass, the strange footprints, the warm rainwater, and all the other small anomalies I'd witnessed over the past year. You have time to decide, David said kindly. The contract doesn't expire for another 27 years, but we wanted you to understand what you're really caring for here. What happens if the boundary fails completely? Let's hope you never have to find out, Teddy said, his child's voice suddenly carrying the weight of decades. The figures began to fade again, becoming translucent and then nearly invisible. Continue following the rules, Vincent. Eleanor's voice drifted on the still air. And remember, we're not the only ones watching. With that, they disappeared entirely, and the cemetery returned to normal. The glow around the headstones faded to its usual subtle level, and the night sounds of insects and small animals resumed. I stood on my porch for a long time, processing what I'd learned. The next morning, I called Robert Crane, the Whitmore family lawyer. Mr. Fielding, what can I do for you? I need to understand my employment contract, I said. Specifically, the long-term expectations. Crane was quiet for several seconds. What prompted this question? Let's just say I've gained a better understanding of my responsibilities. I see. Well, the contract is quite generous, as you know. Full salary for life, plus housing and benefits. All contingent on your continued satisfactory performance, of course. And after my life? I'm sorry? What happens after I die, Mr. Crane? Another long pause. That would depend on the choices you make, Mr. Fielding. The Whitmore family has always been flexible in their arrangements with dedicated employees. I want to see the full contract, the real one. I'll have a copy sent to you by courier today. The contract arrived that afternoon. It was much longer than the version I'd originally signed, with several additional pages that outlined what they called extended service opportunities. The language was carefully crafted to sound like generous benefits rather than supernatural obligations, but the meaning was clear. I could continue as caretaker for as long as I wanted. When I eventually died, I would have the option to remain on the property as a guardian, maintaining the boundary between worlds in exchange for continued existence. The contract also included detailed information about the boundary itself. The woods behind the cemetery apparently contained what the document called a natural portal to adjacent realities. Left unguarded, it would allow the passage of entities incompatible with local biological and physical laws. In simpler terms, things that shouldn't exist in our world would start showing up in our world. The 5 special graves contained people who had volunteered to prevent that from happening. They'd been doing this job for decades, some for nearly a century. But supernatural service contracts apparently had expiration dates. I spent the next few weeks thinking about my options. I could quit and try to find another job, but I'd grown attached to the peaceful little cemetery. Despite its strangeness, it felt like home. More importantly, I'd come to care about the 5 guardians who dedicated their afterlives to protecting people who would never know they existed. I could stay and continue as a normal caretaker, following the rules without committing to anything beyond my natural lifetime. But that would mean finding someone else to take over when I got old, and there was no guarantee they'd be as understanding about the situation. Or I could accept the eventual transition and become a guardian myself when the time came. It wasn't an easy decision, but as spring turned to summer, I found myself leaning toward the third option. The work wasn't difficult, and the 5 guardians seemed like good people who'd made their choice for noble reasons. If I eventually joined them, I'd be helping to protect innocent families from dangers they couldn't imagine. On a warm evening in June, exactly 1 year after I'd started working at Whitmore Cemetery, I made my decision. I walked to the center of the 5 special plots and spoke to the empty air. "I'll stay," I said simply. "When the time comes, I'll take the job." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, very faintly, I heard 5 voices whisper, "Thank you," in perfect unison. The next morning, I found a new addition to Harold's notebook. A 6th page had appeared, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Plot 50, Vincent Fielding, fresh coffee placed beside headstone each morning. Black, no sugar, replaced daily. Plot 50 was currently empty, just a peaceful patch of grass near the center of the cemetery. But someday, probably many years from now, it would be my final resting place. The thought should have terrified me, but instead I felt oddly comforted. I had a purpose now, a job that mattered in ways most people would never understand. And when my time as a living caretaker was over, I'd continue the work alongside 5 friends who'd been waiting decades for reliable help. I've been the caretaker of Whitmore Private Cemetery for over a year now. I follow the rules exactly, maintain the boundary faithfully, and take pride in my work. The coffee rule won't go into effect for many years yet, but I've already started practicing. Every morning, I brew a fresh pot and drink a cup while walking through the cemetery. It's good coffee. I think I'll enjoy it even more when I don't need to sleep anymore. The 5 guardians and I have plenty of time to become better acquainted. After all, we're going to be working together for a very long time.